Hello, thank you for joining this workshop today. Before we dig in and I hand over to kind of Serge and Ruud to take you through the content, just to quickly say, join us on Slack for this one. In general, this is sort of something you can choose to do or not, but for this particular workshop, you will need to be in the MP-authoring channel on Slack because we'll be sharing exercises that way. So take a note of this bit.ly URL. Let me just quickly show you what it looks like and how to use it for those who aren't familiar. So this is Slack, and this is the SCOMathon workspace. If you have other workspaces, they'll appear here. If you have other workspaces, you'll be familiar. All the channels are listed here. The channel you need is the MP-authoring one, which isn't in my channel list. If it's not in your channel list, you go to Add Channels just here and browse all channels, and then you should see MP authoring. There it is. And hit join, and by doing so it will appear in the list, and this is what it looks like. So we'll be sharing files, the exercises throughout in this way. So again, make sure you have this URL written down and set yourself up on the Slack workspace now. And just to say, if you have any issues with doing that, let us know via the chat or the Q&A, and someone will be available to help you. On with the show. Thank you.
Hey Serge, welcome, and welcome you all to this SCOMathon 2020 Winter Edition tutor version, if I'm not mistaken. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, depending on when you're watching and of course from where you're watching. And Serge, you of course a warm welcome as well.
Thank you very much. Same to you, Ruud. Warm welcome also to all the viewers that are watching. Lovely to do this again. So thanks, Squared Up and Cookdown, for having us again. I'm here together with Ruud.
Hello all. And so last time we screwed up a bit the workshop, not the workshop, but the presentation with a demo. So this time we made sure not to include any demo to have some issues around that. But our topic for today is considerations when developing management pack using PowerShell resources.
Yeah.
And Serge, if you can do the intro about the agenda.
I would love to. Thanks, Ruud. So in a moment, we're going to do a short introduction for those who haven't met us already during a previous workshop or maybe a customer engagement. We're also going to have a look at the session intro, where we will also take you through the exercise setup to make sure that you have everything set up correctly, because we're not only going to discuss several customer scenarios with you that we've lined up for this session, but they're also accompanied by exercises which you can take in between the different customer scenarios that we're going to discuss. And after all the exercises and scenarios have been discussed, there's enough time to do question and answer session, after which we will wrap up. So let's start with myself. Little over 20 years of experience in IT. I started when I was a very young IT engineer. So nowadays I work at Microsoft, been working at Microsoft for over little 6 years now, focusing on monitoring as well as automation. And when I started out, it was mainly monitoring, but nowadays I'm focusing on DevOps and on Azure monitoring, so it's cloud related, and then with the focus on DevOps and monitoring. Fortunately, I'm accompanied by a great colleague, Ruud.
Thank you. So I see we made a small error on this slide, because you probably still know us as Premier Field Engineers, but these days we are called Customer Engineers, so that's our new function name.
Yeah.
And same for me. It's sort of like a recap, almost what Serge said. Also 20 years of experience in IT, working since April last year at Microsoft as a customer engineer and focusing on monitoring and with a passion for automation. So besides having a focus on things like SCOM and Azure Monitor, I'm also hosting workshops for related to PowerShell.
Yeah.
So let's go to the session intro. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at, okay, what kind of PowerShell modifications are needed in order to have proper SCOM monitoring. We're going to look at security considerations, the whole workflow that's needed to create, for example, monitoring, but also tasks and recoveries. We're going to look at override capabilities, because especially that part is going to be the part that makes this workshop so interesting. And in the end, we're going to bring all together.
And during the exercise, you're going to use authoring tools to work on the management pack. So what we did when creating management, what we did and what we do when we create management packs is we use Visual Studio 2019. So there are a lot of different versions of Studio 2019, or editions, I should say. So you can use the professional edition, you can use the enterprise edition, but you can use the community edition as well, which you can download from myvisualstudio.com. Then also we are working with SCOM 2019 in our environment, which is preferred. You can also use SCOM 2016. So either is okay to work on. We have exercise setup document in the exercise folder, and maybe Ruud, you can show the folder to us so that everyone knows how it looks. So in here we have the exercise setup.pdf, which contains all the information you need to set up your exercise environment so that you can participate in the exercises we've lined up for you after each customer scenario. And then the folder also contains some additional folders for the exercises where you can see the PDF files. So these are the actual exercises that we're going to work with, and these includes all the steps for you to create an actual part of the entire management pack. And we've also included the PowerShell script along with all the answers. So for each exercise, we have the exercises, the PowerShell scripts, as well as all the management pack parts, so that in the end, if you don't have enough time or if you experience some kind of issues while compiling your management pack, you can still use these to have a working solution, which you can implement in your test environment to fiddle with.
One thing, of course, if you're going to use SCOM 2012 as your test environment, or maybe even if you're going to use it in your production environment, please make sure that when you start your Visual Studio project and you're going to grab the management pack template, in that case, use the SCOM 2012 template. Because in this scenario, we're going to use the SCOM 2016 template. But in that case, you will have issues importing the management pack because the references are missing. So in that case, use the SCOM 2012 template. We haven't tested with SCOM 2012. It should work. And there is nothing in there that shouldn't work, but please make sure at least to change it to the SCOM 2012 template.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Ruud.
So in that case, we are going to the customer scenario and we're going to look for the monitoring workflow, the monitor workflow. And what we're going to do is we are going to sort of do a little role play. In every scenario, we've got 3 scenarios. One of us is going to play the customer and the other one is going to play the person that's going to alter the management pack. Sort of similar to what you have in a real life scenario. In this case, it's going to be a slightly different situation because it's going to be funny. Because one of the customer in this case, and Serge will be the customer at first, is a SCOM administrator. The only thing is he doesn't have any, let's say for this customer scenario, he doesn't have any altering knowledge at all. So Serge, customer, how are you doing?
Well, I'm doing fine actually, because recently we installed a new SCOM environment. So it's 2019 with the latest update rollup installed, of course, and everything is working peachy. Installation went pretty well, considering that we have a total of 16 management servers in our environment. This might not be the case for all our viewers, but especially when you're going to use some heavy management packs that can introduce quite a load on your environment, you might want to expand your amount of management servers. So in our scenario, we have a total of 16 management servers. And everything is going okay, except I keep receiving messages about service principals not being set for my management servers. So normally I would just dive into the SPN to see whether it's okay. But in this case, I'm a SCOM administrator, so I don't have any privileges within Active Directory. So it's going to be a little bit tricky for me to just check to see what SPNs are set correctly and what SPNs aren't set correctly. And then I won't be doing this for 16 management servers because it's going to be very time consuming. And with all the manual work that I'm going to do, I might be a little bit afraid that I'm going to introduce some errors. So hopefully, Ruud, you can help me out in solving the alerts that I experience.
Yeah, of course we can do that. But big question, of course, is do you have a solution how we can check if these SPNs are existing or not?
I currently don't have any solution. So what I tend
No,
to
Serge,
do.
you're saying it incorrect. You as a customer, you have a script. Psst. I'm just gonna give you a hint. You've got the script.
Yeah, I know. So what I was going to tell you is I'm trying to make it a little bit difficult for you to understand what I'm going through. So I'm teasing you here a little bit. So no, true. I do have a script. I tend to use set SPN to check. And if I have to do it for multiple servers, I tend to automate. It's your passion. So I wanted to align with your passion. So I automated it using a PowerShell script. And now I would love to use this PowerShell script within SCOM to work on the issue that I'm facing.
Okay, great. So maybe one thing, I've just not a real break in between, but more like an explanation. So usually it is, of course, when you're going to have a customer talking to you that he or she wants monitoring, it's you're going to have a discussion with that person. And yes, you are going to make a management pack, but you are not usually the subject matter expert on this specific topic. Meaning is that the customer should provide you with most of the information. Meaning is, for example, information, of course, how the application looks, information about how you can check for that specific situation. In this case, we've got the situation to check if the SPNs are existing or not. Yes, of course, in this case, I'm also an automation expert, but doesn't mean that I know how to do that specific check. So it's very important always to check with your customer to make sure that whatever they have that can help you in this case, that they need to bring that into the scenario. So in this case, I'm going to ask Serge, yeah, he already mentioned, of course, he has a script for that. So the only thing is in this case, and that's what we're going to walk through, is that script doesn't contain anything which is specifically needed for SCOM. But let's go into that whole scenario, and I'm going to ask Serge as the customer some of these questions.
Yeah.
So what we're going to look into are a number of things. We're going to look into the service model. In this case, we're going to dive in it a bit more, but we're going to look into the service model, the help model. Hey, the PowerShell script, of course, is quite important. And then we've got a number of steps we need to take from that on. Probe actions, data sources, monitor types, and monitors. But let's start in this case with the service model. So sort of simple question, do we need a new class? And the question from me to, in this case, Serge, is can you explain a bit where your problem is and what kind of role is that?
Yeah, but of course, I would be more than happy to answer your question. So when I take a look at the alert and specifically the alert details and the alert context, I can see that SCOM reports that the service principal name is missing for my management servers, and then it specifies all the 16 management servers that I have recently installed for my new for my new SCOM 2019 environment. So from what I understand from the alert, there is an object called management server, of which I have 16. And for those 16 objects, I don't seem to have an SPN.
Okay, so and a simple recap from SCOM perspective is that it's all in this case for one particular role, which is the management server. And hey, we are sort of in luck because already in SCOM we have a class specifically for that role. So meaning is we don't need to create any new classes because we already got the management server class. So one thing we are not going to do in this scenario, we're not going to create a specific class for that. So that part we're going to skip. and it makes it easy. We already have something for that, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel for this. So next thing up is the help model. So how can we categorize these types of monitoring? And just to do a recap for this a bit, we've got 4 of these types available. So meaning is we've got availability, and this sort of means is like, is the system available or not? This could be, in this case, for example, is a server stopped or started? Now, we can talk about configuration, meaning is, for example, that certain configuration items are missing. Performance, I think it's quite clear. CPU usage could be one of those. So if your CPU usage is higher for a number of time, that could be one that could be categorized as performance. And last but not least, we've got security. And security is where there is a potential security issue. So, Serge, so based on this information, for which of those 4 categories you think that this would be applicable?
Well, thanks for the question, Ruud. Looking at all the 4 categories and envisioning the SCOM console in front of me, I don't see any issues related to services that have been stopped. And when I take a look at my management server services, I can see that the data access service and the configuration service is starting successfully. So I guess it falls out of scope for the category availability. I don't see any performance issues because when I work in the SCOM console, everything seems to be working very smoothly. I don't have to wait for very long. I don't get any performance related alerts, nor do I get any security related alerts. So based on the categories and some alerts that I don't see in the operations console, taking into account the configuration document or the installation document that I use to install my environment, I'm going to opt for configuration.
Great choice in this case. We're not talking here indeed like availability, anything. So configuration is definitely the one that I would have chosen here myself as well. But always check this with your customer if this is applicable. So I won't say never choose yourself, but always check this with your customer, because it could, for example, if you do put something in availability, this could actually affect the availability reports and everything, and this might not be applicable. So always check with your customer. But thanks, Serge, for the thorough explanation in this case.
My pleasure.
So next one we're going to do is we are going to look at the PowerShell. So in this case, Serge provided a PowerShell script, which we're going to look into the next steps. But in broad sort of steps, these are the steps that we need to take. We need to make sure, of course, the script is suitable for SCOM itself. It could be that there's all kind of things in there. For example, all things like a write log, a write output or a write host in there, all things that we don't need. All those things sort of we can get rid of. We need to make sure that we only get the bases in there and make sure that the script does whatever it needs to do. Yeah. So for SCOM perspective, what we need to do, we need to make sure that we load a new object from the mom script API. From there, we're going to create a property bag. We're going to create property bag values with status, meaning is that we're going to bring status back into SCOM. So for example, saying something is either wrong or right. Could be as well, if we're talking about things more related to performance, you're going to say, hey, this is the value that you're going to present to SCOM. So if you're going to use, for example, a PowerShell script that is going to extract CPU usage of a certain kind, you're going to send back, for example, 90%, or in that case, the value 90. One thing which is more or less optional, but could provide you a lot of information into the alert, is add additional property bag values with additional information. This could be, for example, and we're going to look into that into the next slide, the next slide is where you're going to bring in additional information. For example, what is the, in this case for the SPNs, what is the SPN you're expecting? Sort of last but not least is you need to return the property back to SCOM. And there's still an optional item is you can create events, for example, in the event log. This could be either that your script started, could be that your script stopped, could be some additional information, even if things, for example, failed. All of these things can be brought into, but are optional in this case for the PowerShell script. So So here, this is the example of the script that Serge provided. It's split over 2 screens, so bear with me for a moment. So what this script does, it brings in here a parameter, and that parameter is called domain. And this is already one important thing, because maybe, Serge, can you explain why this for you is so important?
Well, based on the type of SPN that I'm going to set, I might need to include the domain name, or I might not need to include the domain name. So if I configured my management service to use a group managed service account, or maybe a domain user account, I might need to include the domain to know that when I'm registering my SPN, that I take the correct account and domain into account.
Okay, good. So this is one of the things that are gonna make this whole scenario, I wouldn't say difficult, but different than potentially other PowerShell scenarios you're gonna have. Because what we need to do here, we need to include something which is gonna be an override parameter. But here, let's dive first different in the script. So what we're going to do here, we're going to use sim, this is the WMI, sort of WMI, and we're going to get the Win32 service for, in this case specifically, the SDK account, and we're going to extract, in this case, who started that specific account. Now, then we're getting some additional information from here, where we're going to get the DNS host name, but also the domain from a specific SIM class. Now, we're going to do certain things here where the object, in this case in comp details, we're going to have 3 properties. We've got one which is DNS host name, we've got one which is domain, and we've got another one which is going to be called FQDN. And in this expression here, what we're going to do is we're going to combine the DNS host name and the domain. So this is in the end to create the object for all the information that we need. Now here what we have is a situation where if there is a domain being used, we need to do something different, and because in that case we are going to add additional information to the object. Now, eventually, the script itself does certain things where we're going to check with set SPN if the SPNs are available. Do some other stuff here, where here eventually we're going to do the check. Does the hostname SPN actually exist, and does the FQDN SPN exist? And this information is here being written to the screen. Yeah. The only thing for the SCOM perspective is, this is not enough because we can't use the right output. We need to do certain other things. Something you want to add, Serge?
Well, on line 30, you can see that I use the pipeline select object and then -skip1 to make sure that the first line of output is ignored, to make sure that I only have the relevant information stored in my variable.
Great, thanks. So next up is sort of, because this is something that in this case the customer Serge provided. Next step is to actually start modifying this. And this is the first part of the script, because the script is a little bit longer. I want to make sure that everything is right on screen. So here, this part, nothing actually changes. We're still using the parameter domain. Here you can see that we are going to create the new object using the mom script API. We're going to put this into a variable called API. And one thing which was optional, if you can remember, we are going to use another event just to make sure that we are going to make sure from, hey, we know that the script started. I always recommend to do this as less possible, because eventually it's going to flood your event log if you don't need it. I would even say potentially even comment it out with using the hash sign, because if you don't need it, you don't need it. It's a waste of resources in the event log.
True.
Here what we're going to do, we are going to call it SPN check. That's going to be the source, and it's going to be event ID 1555. It's going to be an informational event log, event item, and then the text in there is going to be SPN check started, nothing more than that. Next step is we're going to use the API variable to create the property back. it's going to store this in the variable called back, and we're going to use it in a later moment. Here, the script actually didn't change compared to the original. In the next part, we're going to see here, you're going to see changes. So here what we're going to do is we are going to add property back values. And one thing we're going to add, and let me put the laser pointer on, makes it maybe a bit easier to see for you, is here we're going to use the start name. And this is going to be the property back value. And we're going to include here the name of the variable. And in this case, this will be the name of the account that started the SDK service. The host name will be quite clear. The host name of the machine, in this case, the management server. We include some additional information as well about the FQDN. So what's the FQDN of this machine? And what is the SPN host name which is expected? And what is the SPN for the FQN expected? So far, we have not brought any information in there that's going to say it's either wrong or right. This is only going to be additional information. Now here we see still the same part where we are going to do the part with the set SPN. No changes here and here as well, and no change in this part. And here we're going to see that we're going to add some information. And that information here is, hey, we're going to add the property back value, including here the part where we're going to have the hostname SPN. And in this case, this will report an either a true or a false if that specific SPN is existing or not. Same thing what we do here for an FQDN. So one thing, and it's I want to add to here, and I hope I'm not going to divert too much from the original part, but one thing you always need to be sure is think properly about what you're going to send to SCOM. There's multiple ways of finding out if something is wrong or right. So in this case, in this script, we are going to figure out saying, hey, something is wrong or it's right. But sometimes it's better to send information to SCOM and let, for example, in your monitor type, define if something is wrong or right. Always sort of make that question yourself while you're making that script or while you're changing that script. So for example, if you're going to do certain things with, I'm going to use the example about CPU usage again. If you're going to send CPU usage or you want to create a monitor on that, you can either decide in your script if something is wrong or right, or you can decide I'm going to send, for example, that 90 to SCOM, and from there you're going to determine why. Because, for example, you're going to use other things there. For example, the consecutive samples method, which you're going to do in SCOM, and from there you're going to decide if something is wrong or right. So, but for this specific scenario, we can decide here directly saying, hey, this indeed is wrong or it's right here. And now the fun starts. We are going to do certain things in SCOM. And we're going to start with the probe action module type. Yeah. So usually what you will do is you will use the Microsoft Windows PowerShell property back probe. This is the original, but there is one thing here, and we have one requirement. And that requirement is that we need to make sure that we can set a specific override on the domain parameter. And if you're going to look at this specific original implementation of this probe action module type, you'll see you have a number of configuration items: script name, script body, snap-ins, parameters, timeout seconds, and strict error handling. But if you're going to look at the overridable parameter, you'll see you only have timeout seconds. Meaning is we can't directly use this probe action module type. Now, there's two options what you can do. One thing what you can do is you could copy this probe action module type and change it, but there's only one issue. This one is public, but here we've got the probe action which is it's referencing, which is the Microsoft Windows PowerShell property back probe base, is not public. This is an internal, meaning is that if you want to copy this one and change this and change it to your liking, and you want to reference the type ID of the PowerShell property back probe base, you need to copy that one as well, because otherwise it doesn't work, because it's internal and you can't reference it from a different management pack. But we're still going to use this because we are still going to copy this one, and instead of referencing the Microsoft Windows PowerShell property bag probe base. I'm struggling with words for this one. We are going to reference Microsoft Windows PowerShell property bag pro. So in the next one, what we're going to do is we are going to create our own probe action for this. And it's always a nice discussion because we are here now in a part with naming. Yeah. And Serge and I always have discussions about naming. And this case, I followed the method of Serge. And Serge, can you explain maybe why we are using this naming method here?
Well, for me, it has two specific reasons. And the most important one is I want to make sure that I can easily identify what's going on in terms of probe action module types I create, or module types for that matter, classes, recoveries, relationships. So you have all kinds of types that you can define in Operations Manager when authoring. So the SCOM SPN check is a reference to the actual solution that I'm implementing here. So you will also notice that later on my management pack will be named similar to SCOM SPN check. So that's the relation to my management pack to my solution. Now then, when I'm going to define different types, I want to make sure that when I'm authoring, I don't have to think about what kind of type I created earlier on. So using something like probe action module type makes me help in knowing that this is a probe action. So I don't have to look back in the code to see whether it was an actual probe action. So when you're just defining one or two module types, it won't be very hard to remember. Then again, if you're going to work on an extensive management pack with lots of different module types, and then you have probe action module types, data source module types, then it can become a little bit confusing what kind of type you're working with. So from that perspective, I always like to include a kind of type in the naming convention as well. And as a bonus, when I'm using IntelliSense like control space, it's also neatly organized. So it's sorted alphabetically for examples, which makes it for me quite easy when I'm going to work with language packs and I need to include a lot of these names, then that it's sorted alphabetically and categorized by the kind of module type, for example, or monitor type or class. So that's something that I take into account when I'm considering names, and it's something that I consider upfront before I actually start writing or authoring my management pack.
Yeah, in the end, there is not one best practice. If you're going to look into management packs, you'll see differences where, for example, you get SCOM SPN check .SPN check version 2 dot probe action, for example. There's not a best practice. The only thing is, and that's going to be important, make a naming convention with the team you are going to develop management packs. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
So we're not going to say this is going to be the version you have to use. Nope, this is something we decided on, like Serge and I are always using this method, or at least I started using it after the explanation of Serge, because I used at first as well SCOM check, SPN check version 2 dot probe action, for example. But this one, it actually makes sense because with IntelliSense it makes coding sort of quicker. So that's one of the advantages. So thanks, Serge, for the explanation about this.
My pleasure. Thanks for your question.
So here what we have is the version we created. So what we did, we used the version of the original one. So we gave it a different name. We gave it SCOM SPN check probe action module type SPN check version 2. We are going to give it a public accessibility, so you can reference it as well from different management pack. And one thing is, because we copied this from the original probe action, originally only the Microsoft.Windows.PowerShell schema was mentioned here, but because this one is located into a different management pack, it's in the Windows library management pack, we need to reference it. So here what we're going to do, we're going to add the reference, which in this case is going to be Windows ! So So then you can see the configuration items and the original configurations item, and I'm going to go back just a couple of slides just to show it here. Contained, what was it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those. And if you can check here, we only got 2 because we don't need that much anymore, because a lot of these things we're going to set directly into your probe action. So the only ones that we remained from the original one was timeout seconds, and we added another one which is called domain. And then we're going to get into the overridable parameter. So originally we only had the one with timeout seconds, but we've added one for domain. And in both cases, this is going to be a string, because there's going to be string information in there. It's not going to be a Boolean or anything. It's just going to be a simple string. It's not going to be an integer. It's going to contain a domain name, which could be, for example, domain.local, or it could be contoso.com. It could be any one of those. So one thing I've configured here for domain, I forgot to mention here, we are going to use the min occurs is 0 and max occurs is 1. The reason for that is because the domain configuration parameter is not actually required, but if it's put in some information in there, we only want to see it once.
You read my mind, Ruud. Thanks for explaining that, because that was something that I was going to ask.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
So here what we're going to do, we're going to use exact same things that we're going to use from the original. We didn't even change this name, PowerShell probe is still the same. The only thing what we're going to do here is we are going to reference now the original one, the one that we copied. And because we reference it and it's in a different management pack, we're going to use Windows ! And then we're going to give it some information about what we are going to do. So we give it a name, script name. This is a name you can freely set. It doesn't have anything to do with the name of the file you set into Visual Studio. It's just a simple name. You can decide everything what you want here. Then we got into the script body. And because we're using Visual Studio, we can use a technique called include file content. And the beauty of this is that we can have the script located into Visual Studio as a resource. And we can reference it here with using the include file content. Always make sure to use the same style with the capitalization. So capital I, capital F, capital C, because otherwise weird things could happen. And here what we're going to do is we are going to reference the folder where these scripts are located. So here we've got a folder called resources, and there's another folder called in there PowerShell, because in resources you could have things like images, but also maybe VBS scripts. And I always separate those in folders. Again, just like Serge explained, if you've got a very small management pack, it doesn't maybe make a huge difference. But if you are going to make a more extensive management pack, a certain structure is actually a very handy thing to have. And here we're going to reference the PS1 script, the PowerShell script, which these two names doesn't actually need to match, but this one needs to match with the PowerShell script name, how you provided it into the Visual Studio. So Serge, I heard a noise from your side. So anything to add?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I remember you saying something about a management pack browser, and I fiddled a little bit with altering management packs, and I noticed the management pack browser as well. And from there on, if you dive into a library such as the Windows one.
Yeah, let's bring it onto screen. Maybe a good one. So this is the actual project we're working on for this specific demo. And what you can do from view, you can go to management pack browser, and maybe from here you can sort of take over.
Yeah.
What you wanted to say?
I was indeed wondering why you would come up with a folder name like resources. So thanks for showing this to me, because when I take a look at the management pack browser on the left for the Windows library, I can see folders like service model, health model, presentation. Now, when I look on the right side of the screen where you have defined your solution, I can see a similar folder structure that you created. It does make sense to me. I would do something similar as we discussed earlier on. So,
yeah, for me, the reason is I'm just pure lazy, and I hate choosing names for things. So usually I end up with names like Blub. That's my sort of go-to name. But in this case, I just hate choosing names. I'm going to be honest about it. So hey, if I can borrow something from somewhere else and be more efficient, that's my way to go. So that's why I borrow this structure, and at least it's clear where everything is. And I think that's the same thing for you, Serge.
Yeah, definitely. And it's nice to see that it's quite easily to adhere to standards like this. I guess it's not mandatory, but for me, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and from here, what we actually did, we borrowed the original probe action from here, but from here, actually, with the probe actions from there, we've used the original probe action. So we're gonna skip this part, but here you can see we've got this structure here with resources, PowerShell, and here we've got the PowerShell check.
Yeah.
So let's get back to here. So we referenced the script body. So the reason why I'm using this is that saves you from altering, in this case, or let's say developing your script as well inside the XML. So it's good to separate those two. So the only thing where you can do this, of course, is if you're using, for example, Visual Studio for this. Now, and then there's the next part, is because if you can remember in the script, we needed to set the parameter. Not needed, it was not required, but it's an optional item. So what we're doing here is we're not going to use snap-ins, but we're using here the parameters element. So we're using parameters and we're going to add the parameter. And here you can see we're using the config/domain, which we are getting from the overridable parameter. Now then there's all the other options we originally in the original probe action were sort of set into from the data source and potentially eventually in the monitor. We all set it here because we don't need that be set on a later moment. We just want to make it simple as possible. So strict error handling will be, in this case, will be false. Other than that, we haven't made any changes. So again, it's quite easy. We make ourselves quite efficient by borrowing code from somewhere else.
Yeah.
So next step would be the data source. And you can see here the same style with the naming, SCOMSPNcheck dot, in this case, data source module type dot SPNcheck. And you can see we haven't used here the version 2 for the person that's still awake and paying some attention, because we went to a second iteration with the probe action, but here we have only one iteration. And here what we do is we're using a very basic data source module, nothing weird in here. The only thing what we do is we are, of course, borrowing from the probe action, the one that we previously created, all of the items we need. So what do we need? We need timeout seconds. In this case, we brought something else in there, interval seconds, because we need that for the scheduler to run. And we're going to include, of course, the domain. And here we are seeing the same things, the min occurs and max occurs. So usually what you can do, you can just copy the line from the probe action in this case and copy it into your data source. Same thing for the overridable parameters. Timeout seconds, interval seconds are overridable parameters, and we brought in the one for domain. Now, in this case, one of the simpler schedulers, we're just going to make sure that it runs on a certain interval, which eventually, in this case, in the monitor, will be configured to be running every 5 minutes, which is way too often. But for this specific demo, we're just going to keep it on 5 minutes. And here, what we can see, we are going to reference the probe action we created. You can see here scom.spncheck.probeActionModuleType.spncheckv2. We're going to specify the timeouts, and here we're going to specify the domain with the config domain. Very simple data source module type, nothing special here. It's other than the bring in the domain, it's very simple. Next step, monitor types, and here comes something funny because you can already see, potentially based on the name, we are only going to create a monitor type here, which is specifically for the host name. Because there's two for the SPNs, there's two SPNs. You've got one based on the host name and one based on FQDN. And what we're going to do is we are going to create two separate ones. The reason why we're going to do that is because we are going to create two monitors. yes, you can create one monitor for both, but we are going to create two monitors. Why? Because we can. We want to separate those two. We want to have a different alert for every different type. So one for hostname, one for FQDN. So in this case, we are going to create two monitor types. So what we're doing here, and we've got it split up in two sections, in two slides, because otherwise it wouldn't fit on screen. So here we've got the SCOM SPN check.monitor type.hostname SPN check, and we've got a healthy state and got an unhealthy state. And here you can see again that we bring in the same configuration from, not this case, the probe action. Yes, of course, originally, but in this case from the data source. And we bring the same configuration into the unit monitor type. Now here we've got the domain again, min occurs, max occurs, overridable parameters, nothing changed here. So the only thing what we're going to do here is we are going to reference the data source with the type ID, and that's the data source we've just created. And here you can see that we are also bringing in the configuration that's required for that data source. So you can see timeout seconds, interval seconds, and domain. Again, we're not specifying any values in here. The only thing what you see here are the items which are used in the overridable parameters. We will set this on a later moment. So next part of the monitor type is the part where we are going to do the thing with to determine, hey, what's healthy and what's not healthy, or in this case, unhealthy. So I don't know if you can remember, but in the PowerShell script, we've added property bag values. We've added two. One was a hostname SPN and one was FQDN. And what we brought into there is that the text is going to be either true or false. So what we're going to do here in this condition detection is we're going to bring in an expression filter, and we're going to say, hey, if that specific property, in this case, the property for the property bag value, hostname SPNs equals true, then this is going to be healthy. And you can probably already imagine what we're going to do with the unhealthy part. Here we're going to say, hey, if hostname SPN equals false, then it's going to be unhealthy. There's one thing you always need to be aware of certain situations. In this case, it's not really applicable. But if you're going to do certain things, for example, with actual values, it's recommended to not use this specific style, because let's say you've got here a value which is, for example, 90, and you bring here as well a value of 90, and you're going to say not equal, or you're going to say higher or lower than. You always have a situation where you're potentially going to miss the part with if that value is 90 itself. So always be careful what you do here. If you're going to use with values, you're most likely going to have things like greater than or lower than, but always make sure to include that value itself as well. But here it's not applicable. We only got true or false here.
So thanks for the tip, Ruud, and sorry for the interruption, but
No
I've
worries.
got a question. Would you consider this to be a critical design moment in terms of where we actually going to decide when something's wrong or right? Because I can remember earlier on during the PowerShell snippet discussion, you were mentioning that you can add something in the bag and then in the property bag. And then you can do some kind of decision in PowerShell where it's okay or not. But you can also use it, you can also determine whether something's healthy or not with a condition detection.
Yeah, so yes and no. It's a good question. So in this case, what we're going to do is there's always that moment where you're going to define if something sort of is wrong or right. In this case, we are going to say we are going to send back to SCOM only true or false, but we still need to match that to a specific condition, meaning it's going to be either healthy or unhealthy. So you always need that part in SCOM. But if you're going to talk, for example, about values, and I mean numerical values, and let's say what I mentioned, for example, with the CPU usage, then that's something, it's a critical moment where you're going to decide where you're going to define what's wrong or right. Because if you're going to define with a numerical value in your PowerShell script to, for example, decide if CPU usage is higher than 90%, I'm going to send back false. then you're going to maybe miss out on certain potential options in SCOM, like the consecutive samples you are going to be able to do. That you're going to miss out on that. Yes, you can still do that if there is a number of these items, for example, where if that falls, if, for example, 6 items are false, then you're still going to raise an alert about this. But it makes certain things maybe more difficult. For example, as well, bringing overrides, it's especially on the override part which makes it more difficult. Because in the case where you're going to use numerical values and you're going to send that and you're going to use an override on it, you need to send it completely to your script. But in the case where you're going to do it to your monitor type, you only need to send your override configuration only to your monitor type. That's the part we need. So it's yeah, it's definitely a critical design moment. Maybe even on an earlier stage already, potentially already with your probe action where you're going to need to think about this.
Yeah. So thanks for elaborating on that. Makes a lot of sense. Do you mind if I have another quick question?
Yes, of course.
Because I
don't mind.
I read something about on-demand detections as well, besides the regular detections. Are on-demand detections something you use regularly, or maybe you don't use it at all?
Yeah, no, I do need it. I do use it. The only case, and maybe some explanation for people that don't know what the difference is. Here you can see indeed the part where we see regular detection. And you all know, of course, in SCOM, if you do you have a monitor and you do a recalculate, it not always works. And the reason why it not always works is the fact that it hasn't been brought into the let's say the code by the original developer. So here I on purposely never included the part into the regular detection or into this monitor type. Has something to do to make it not more complicated than it should be in this case. But here you can see we've got regular detections, and regular detection means that in this case we're going to use the normal schedule, meaning is it's going to run every 300 seconds, which we'll configuring later. If you want to make sure that the recalculate is available, you need to include as well an option with an on-demand detection. It's similar to what you do here. The only thing where you need to make some differences in how you are going to trigger that specific probe action, or you're going to potentially need to create a separate probe action for that because it's a different type. But here in this case, for this specific demo, to make it not even more complicated, I'll only include a regular detection. So here, a recalculate, it will not work. It will only use the regular detection and it only will use the schedule from the data source.
All right, thank you.
So next one, we had the hostname check. And here we've got the same thing for the FQDN. So what we did, created a new one, FQDN. We are going to use the same data source. And the reason why we're using the same data source, because we bring in cookdown. Meaning is that script doesn't actually need to run multiple times. What it does, that script run once, it will send information to the property bag value, and both monitor types will actually use that information from that script that only run once. As long as you are sending the same parameters to the data source. So even if you're sending, for example, do an override on domain, then in that case, what will happen is that the potentially cookdown will be broken. But as long as if you're not using any override, which is a very rare situation, cookdown will be in place. But here the difference is, I'm going to skip to this screen pretty quickly. It's similar to what the other monitor type is. Here we're going to do the difference that we are going to use the property bag value for the SPN, and here as well. And then finally, we are getting into the monitors. So we're starting with the SCOM SPN check monitor.hostname SPN check. And here what we see is a very common monitor. So let's start only with the first line because I couldn't get it onto one screen. So we'll start with the first line, starting of course with the ID. In this case, accessibility will be public. It's enabled. And here you can see we bring in the information from the service model, because here we're going to see that we are going to target the Microsoft System Center Management Server class. Quickly bring in the continuation of the line. And here you can see we are going to bring in the configuration state. So this is the monitor, the parent monitor. Meaning is this will be falling under the category of configuration state. This one remote will be true. We could have set here, to be honest, also false. Priority will be normal. And here you can see we're using the type ID for the SCOMSPNcheck.monitorType.hostname SPN check. So here we are using the monitor type that we've just created for specifically for the hostname. Now, back to here. We specified here it's going to be category configuration held, and we are going to include an alert message, and that part in our language pack will contain the part about the alert itself. So the alert message. In this case, it will be a warning. Auto resolve will be true. Priority will be normal, and we're going to do for the severity do a match monitor held. So in this case, it will be a warning. And here you can see we bring in some alert parameters, and this is the part which I mentioned into my the part of the script. You can bring additional information here that could help give the end user, in this case the SCOM administrator, some information about, hey, what was actually expected. So here you can see we are going to bring information, and for example about the service account that started the SDK servers. What was the host name of the servers of the server? What was the FQDN of the server, and what was the expected hostname SPN, and what was the expected FQDN? That's the information we're going to bring into here. Now here we're going to say, hey, it will be healthy is going to be the success, and we've got unhealthy, it's going to be in health state warning. And here you can see we've got a timeout of 300 seconds, which to be honest, it's a very short script. It should actually run with a shorter time, but we'll leave it to a timeout of 300 seconds. And the interval seconds is 300 seconds, so 5 minutes. I would say in a real life scenario, this is something you can run, for example, maybe once a day, maybe twice a day. It doesn't need to run that often. So twice a day most likely is more than enough. Yeah. And here you can see we use the domain and it hasn't been specified. We're gonna specify an empty element here because in this case, we are by default not going to specify it, but we want to present it as an empty part there. So it definitely is there. Did you want to mention something, Serge? I heard some noise from your side.
No, I totally agree with you.
Okay, thank you. Always good to hear. Hey, and then the same thing we're going to do for the host name. And I'm not going to spend much time on this one because you can see it's relatively the same. The only difference here is we've got, of course, FQDN SPN check. And here you can see that we are going to reference the SCOM SPN check.monitor type FQDN SPN check. That's going to be the only difference. Other than that, it's same. I wouldn't make it any more different than it actually is. And in that case, it actually is, if you build this now, and I always recommend building in between every step, because otherwise you end up at the end with potentially a lot of failures. Always, even if you're going to make your PowerShell script, maybe build it. If you're going to include your probe action, build it, see what kind of errors you get, and then build up to the next step. And then we are actually in exercise 1.
Right.
Did I miss anything, Serge? Anything else I probably need to explain a bit more?
No, not at all. I'm very keen to start working on this exercise because that would mean, as a SCOM administrator, I can do my first authoring and then implement my own solution for this scenario. So I'm quite happy.
Good. So one thing with exercise 1 is this could be for some people that haven't done much PowerShell authoring, or sorry, that haven't done much management pack authoring, could be quite a lot because that's always the problem with SCOM monitoring. If you're going to alter something, you need to take a lot of steps with monitoring to get to the endpoint. But don't worry about it. If you can't figure it out, do a little peek into the answers. Don't do that too often, of course. Don't start copying and pasting, but try to see if you can figure it out. We've given a lot of hints into the document as well, so most of it shouldn't be that difficult. But if you can't figure it out, check in the answers. Like Serge already mentioned, working code can be found in the answer folders. And the time needed, we think that you need for this is roughly 45 minutes. So what we'll do is we'll give you 45 minutes of time now, and then I would say start coding. Anything else you want to add, Sergio?
Not for the moment. Thanks for explaining this specific scenario, or actually the solution to this specific scenario. I'm looking forward to starting authoring. So I won't peek at the answers just yet, and then I'll see you in 45 minutes. Thanks.
Okay. Hey, good luck and have fun.
Thanks, you too.
Stop. Hey, thank you all being back after exercise 1. Hope you all had a successful exercise and you've got some working monitoring now. Just gonna quickly show what's going on here.
Whoa, Ruud, I can see that you have 4 warnings.
Yeah, I haven't got it correctly configured, as you can see here. I'm missing all my SPNs. I've got 2 management servers and I'm missing them for both the FQDN and both for their host name.
Yeah.
So yeah, I screwed up a bit. So Serge, we switched roles a bit. I'm
Yeah.
the customer now. You are now the SCOM god, knows SCOM and SCOM authoring. But me as a customer, what I want now, I want to have an option where I can create the SPNs from SCOM. Can you help me with that?
Yeah, sure, Ruud. Thanks for asking. So let's pretend for a moment that I have the same knowledge of SCOM and authoring as you already clearly demonstrated. But yeah, we can definitely take a look at the possibilities we have for you to implement a solution that you can actually work with the alerts that are shown in a way that you can resolve the issue. So what we can do is we can use tasks. So let's have a look at how we can add some missing SPNs using tasks. So we have once again the SCOM administrator, which is you in this case. You do have some authoring knowledge, and I'm going to pretend that mine is as much as yours. So you clearly demonstrated how we can monitor that servers are missing their SPNs, management servers in these cases. And now we're going to use a PowerShell script so that we can add service principal names, which should hopefully resolve the monitors. As you clearly demonstrated when creating the unit monitors, we set auto resolve to true. So as soon as the SPNs are generated correctly and the monitor picks them up, we should have no more alerts. They should auto resolve. So thanks for giving me that PowerShell script. You're obviously as lazy as I am in terms of manually performing the registration of SPN. So I'm glad you provided the PowerShell script, which I'm gladly going to use. Apologies. I'm also going to use a write action in this specific case. And we're also going to use a task so that we can register those SPNs based on the alerts that we received. So now you provided me the PowerShell script in which we're going to use set SPN to correctly configure the PowerShell script. So in this specific case, I don't have to take any additional actions on the PowerShell script. So previously you demonstrated how we can use property bags to provide information that we gathered from the system to SCOM, and then we can use a condition detection to determine whether we're healthy or not. So in this case, as I shown previously, we're going to use a write module and a task. So I'm going to leave your PowerShell script as is. Before I dive into the write action module and before I dive into the task to help you resolve those alerts, I want to address a security consideration, and this is an important object. So we're going to run tasks, and as you might have discovered already when executing a task, you have the ability to provide additional credentials. So in my example, I'm not going to provide additional credentials. Instead, I'm going to just run the task. And this means that it's going to use the management server action account. This might result in some problems because Ruud, I don't know how you got it configured, but if you want to register a service principal in Active Directory, does your account have the appropriate permissions to do so, or are you required to use alternate credentials?
No, we're using alternative credentials for that. So because we're going to dive in bit about that a little bit more in a later moment. But what we do now is one of the colleagues has the permissions to actually set the SPNs. Yeah, we have someone that actually can do that. We can use those credentials. So I was sort of hoping that we can create a task that the moment we start the task, he just walks by, fills his credentials, runs on the start the task, and then maybe start them. That could be a viable solution for now at first.
Yeah, sure. Definitely. We're going to address the security considerations later on as well. So I'm just going to skip it for now, but it's not off topic anymore. So we'll look into that later. First of all, let's have a look at how we can achieve such a task. So for this specific case, we're going to use a write action module. And as Ruud already has shown previously, you can use the Management Pack browser to navigate in the Windows library and check out all the module types and monitor types that we have. So in this specific case, we are looking at a PowerShell write action, which we derive from the Windows library. So once again, since this particular type ID is in a different management pack, we need to reference the management pack that actually contains this PowerShell write action. So hence we're going to do the Windows exclamation mark. So this alias is the actual reference to the other management pack. Now, as Ruud has shown you during the previous exercise and customer scenario, we saw Visual Studio with the actual management pack, and on the right side we had the actual management pack properties. From there you also have a folder references where all the actual references are listed. So in my specific case, I looked at the reference and I noticed that I can use this alias to use the PowerShell write action.
Serge, maybe to interrupt you for a moment,
Sure.
because I think it would be handy. I think we forgot that slide in here to explain a little bit, and let me share it for a moment.
Please
Is
go ahead.
show the script, because there's some additional information in here that might be actually important for the viewers to know what it is, because we've got two scripts. So if you can remember from the other one, we had the parameter only domain. In the new one, what we're doing, we actually have an additional parameter called SPN to add.
Yeah.
And SPN to add has three different options, three different items that can actually be used as a parameter value, which is hostname, FQDN, and both. And depending on which one you specify as a parameter value, it will add those SPNs. So you can actually specify individual SPNs. So it won't actually start adding them just randomly or which one is missing. No, it will specify, it will add the SPNs which ones are missing. So it might be some additional information why we're doing certain things in the write action.
Yeah. So thanks again for showing this PowerShell. Besides being a great colleague, SCOM expert, and management pack authoring guru, you're also a great mind reader. So maybe you can read my mind where I tell you to open the references folder so you can display the Windows alias like I mentioned.
I already stopped sharing my screen, so you have to do that.
Yeah, okay. So maybe I wasn't sending clear signals right now. So thanks again for showing the actual PowerShell code. And as I mentioned, you read my mind. So hopefully what you recognize from the previous exercise and the customer scenario is that we have the write action module type ID.
Sergio, can you share your screen again?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry for that.
No problem at all. That would actually help. So hopefully you can all see my screen again.
Yes.
And then from the top on line 3, you can see the write action module type I was referring to. And the ID that we've configured is SCOM-SPN check.write action module type.spn. And we covered naming conventions earlier on. Hopefully this looks very familiar to you, where we have the configuration of the parameters. And like Ruud mentioned, in the PowerShell script, we have the SPN to add parameter as well as the domain parameter. So for the SPN to add, we're not going to make it overridable. So the only overridable parameter right here is the domain parameter. And then we're going to use a Microsoft.Windows.PowerShell write action. So once again, we have the script name, which can be anything you want. Then we have the script body, like we saw in the previous scenario as well. So please make sure that you take the case sensitivity into account, because if you just type everything lowercase, Visual Studio will throw an error at you. And then we've got the parameters that we're going to pass to the PowerShell script. So from here, we're just going to pass the value of the parameters as we define them here. We're not going to define anything explicit just yet, except the timeout in seconds, which has been set to 120 seconds, which is 2 minutes. And then again, in the input and output type, we have the base data. Don't forget to mention the appropriate management pack. So we're going to use the system alias to manage the input and output type. So this is very basic write action module type. We don't have to do a lot of work right here. And this is part of where the magic happens, because the second part is the actual task. And as you can see, we've got some task defines. So we are going to use the SCOM SPN check write action module type .spn, as you just saw in the previous slide, where we're going to do the actual magic. We're going to execute the PowerShell script. But as Ruud already mentioned as well, we need to provide some parameters to the actual PowerShell script. So as he mentioned, we have a validate set containing 3 items, which are hostname, FQDN, and both. So that's why we have 3 tasks. The first task is just going to add is going to pass the hostname value as a parameter to our PowerShell script. So we're just going to configure the hostname SPN, or the SPN for the hostname. We can also do the same just for the FQDN. So by specifying explicitly which part of the SPN we want to set, we can run the script. And then as the third and last one, we can also add both of them. So this is why we have 3 tasks. So for each alert that we receive, we can execute a task, and then we can set just a host name, just a FQDN, SPN, or actually both.
Serge, maybe some question in between. You're using here write action, but you can use in a task as well a probe action. So why are you using a write action here?
Well, the main reason for me to use a write action is because I'm actually going to change something on the system. So as the word probably already mentions, a probe action is meant to get data from the system, but not necessarily alter data on the system. So a write action is meant to be used when you're actually going to change stuff on your system. And since we're actually going to change the SPN, I'm using a write action.
Okay, good to know. Thanks.
My pleasure. So I'm very lucky, because with having to use just a write action module type and defining the 3 tasks, we already come to the end of this specific customer scenario. So like we saw earlier when we started this meeting, we have a folder with the exercises. Hopefully you had a lot of fun completing exercise 1. Which hopefully, well, maybe not hopefully returned missing SPNs, but hopefully implemented well on your test environment. Please make sure not to just perform these actions in production. I would very much like to invite you to start with exercise 2. So we're going to implement the write action module and the tasks so that you can resolve the alerts, if any, for the missing SPNs. We have the documents in the exercise 2 folder. We also included the answers, so try to steer away from the answers just yet. Hopefully the hints in the documents are enough for you to complete this exercise. We estimate that it will take 15 minutes for you to complete this exercise, after which we'll discuss the last customer scenario with you for today. please keep in mind that when you have completed this exercise, you will still need to provide alternate credentials when running this task. It's something we'll dive into in the next customer scenario. So I'm not going to spoil the last slides just yet. But for now, when using these tasks, we have to use alternate credentials that have the permission to actually register SPNs in Active Directory. So, Ruud, thank you very much for being such a great customer. We always enjoy such great customers as yourselves. So to the audience, lots of authoring fun with the second exercise, and we'll see you back in roughly 15 minutes.
Hey, thanks. Being back after exercise 2, you survived it. Hopefully everything is working again. This one should have been a lot easier than the first one. A lot less steps, but this is now sort of how it should look. Let's get back to SCOM. So we had the 4 alerts. So we've got here 2-1 for SPNs missing. And we've got some tasks now. So you can see here, we've got some tasks. So let's just run one. If we would run this with the predefined runners account, so let's try it. If you would run it, make it a bit bigger so you can easily see it. You'll get actually an error, which in this case states insufficient sufficient access rights to perform the operation. So why? Because this one runs with the management server action account.
Yeah.
So, and because you run it with the management server action account, at least you run it with the management server action account. So what we do here, if we now run this with my account, which I have the rights, I didn't know if I did the SPN, doesn't really matter too much. Well, let's do the FQDN. And I'm using the other, I'm going to specify my account, my password, and run it. You'll see that the updated object. Now we've got the monitor to run every 5 minutes, meaning is that within now and 5 minutes, we should actually have a working solution. At least that monitor should, that alert should disappear. We're not going to wait for the 5 minutes because we are on a schedule and we've got a deadline. So we will continue. Oh, that's the wrong screen. Don't need that one. I think, Serge, you'll take over from here, I guess, the slides.
Yes, sir, I will. And thanks for showing us the actual task that should resolve the alerts. So, as Ruud demonstrated, that whenever you don't specify alternate credentials, the task runs as the management server action account, and clearly it didn't have enough permissions as it should. So actually stuff is configured correctly here in terms of access permissions for the management server action account. We had to provide alternate credentials, after which the SPN successfully registered. So what we can do as well, which will hopefully alleviate the burden of having to run these tasks manually, is to implement a recovery task workflow. So whenever we notice that an SPN is configured incorrectly, we can have a recovery task correct it automatically. So once again, we have a scenario where the SCOM administrator is very knowledgeable but lacks some authoring knowledge.
That's me.
And me. So we also have the SPNs missing on the management server, but fortunately we have the monitor that shows the alerts for which management servers the actual SPNs are missing. So as Ruud demonstrated, you can run a task manually to resolve the issue. We're going now to automate it, since both Ruud and I are very lazy and automation can be a very powerful tool. Well, let's go ahead and benefit from the advantages that SCOM brings you. So automate it. And for that, we have the PowerShell script. So once again, we don't need to take any actions, because the PowerShell script clearly demonstrates that it does a good job in registering SPNs. So hopefully later on, Ruud, the alert has disappeared. But before we actually dive into creating the recovery task, we have this very important topic we need to discuss. Because we saw just now that when Ruud executed the task to register the SPN, we had to do something with credentials. So we need to make sure that whenever the task is run, we have appropriate permissions to register the service principal name. So there are a couple of ways you can achieve this, and Ruud demonstrated one of them. He was probably using his domain admin account, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so thank you for demonstrating that, Ruud. I consider this to be a no-go. This is probably not what you want to do. Have your domain admins run those tasks for you, because you would probably have to tell them why you are doing it and what you want to do, and maybe you need to even raise a change before one of the domain admins comes help you or assign you domain admin rights. So what we could do as well is use permission delegations within Active Directory, and then assign specific permissions to an account in Active Directory that has enough permissions to register the SPN. Also, it might need permissions to delete an SPN. It could be granted at a user object. So whenever you go to your services snap-in from the MMC console and you check the data access service and the configuration service, you can either see that it runs as local system, or perhaps as a domain user, or even a group managed service account, because System Center Operations Manager 2019 supports group managed service accounts. So what you could do is, instead of working with domain admin rights, use a designated user object or group managed service account object to assign the appropriate service principal permissions. And then when you have done that, it'll make our task a whole lot easier. Please keep in mind, though, which account you are going to use for this. You might use your management server action account, but then again, you can use that account to register SPNs and delete SPNs for a whole lot of objects. So maybe that's not what you want. And I'm very curious from a customer perspective to see what might be do's and don'ts. Ruud, do you have any considerations you want to share with the audience?
No, in this case, there's a number of things you can do, and we're going to dive into maybe a bit that's not really needed for, let's say, this whole workshop tutor thing, because this is more something in general. But always make sure that you're, of course, using the least amount of permissions. That's more or less the recommendation. So one thing what you need to be sure, especially on this topic regarding SPNs, is that if you are using your if your SDK account runs with a normal service account, then you need to make sure in AD to permission that that account, or the OU where those accounts that account is, with the descendant user objects. If you're using group managed service account, you need to specify descendant MSDS group managed service accounts. But this is something you need to do in AD, so to delegate it. So it might be that you need to ask one of your AD colleagues, could be from a different team, to actually make sure that it happens. And then what you need is the right service principal permission. That's specifically for this case, but always, and it's not only about this specific case, always make sure to use, of course, the least amount of privileges if possible. For this specific case, this is what you need. In the end, in the explanation, in the exercise 3, which you will have, it will be explained a little bit more in detail. But this is something you have to keep in mind. So what we did for this purpose is we've created a specific account. We're not going to use the agent management server agent action account. No, we are going to use a specific account, because this is something you might find in other situations as well, where you lack permissions. You are going to use, in that case, you most likely you're using the local system account in that case, because you're running it from an agent and not from a management server. In that case, you need to create a run as account anyway. So here as well, for the purpose of this workshop, we are going to create a run as account. We've given it enough permissions, and now it's up to Serge to tell us how it actually works.
Well, thanks for sharing your insights and advices with us. Much appreciated. I'm going to try to explain to you how you can implement such a mechanism. So throughout the customer scenarios and the exercises, we've created monitor types, module types, unit monitors, and so on. We also have a write action module type that we created earlier, which works together with the tasks. So before we're going to work on the actual recovery task, which is not going to be very much work, we need to take into account one additional step. As Ruud mentioned, we created a specific user account within Active Directory we can use for the service principal registration. But to be able to use it in our management pack, we need to introduce a run as profile. So this piece of code actually introduces a run as profile within Operations Manager, and later on we're going to link it to our write action module. So from the type definitions, you can see that it's all about a secure reference, and we've called it SCOMSPN check.securereference.spn account. And then this is the actual run as profile. So this is not the run as account, it's the run as profile that is going to contain the run as account later on. So this is a very simple piece of code from my perspective. It's just including a secure reference, and then we have the actual run as account. Now, to be able to make use of all the run as accounts defined in our profile, we just simply need to modify our write action module type on one bit. We're going to introduce the run as property. And as you saw in the previous slide, we named it SCOMSPN check.securereference.spn account. And this is what we reference within the run as property. And from now on, our write action module task is actually connected to our run as profile, which means that if I define run as accounts in my run as profile, this particular write action module type will pick it up. So that's all we're going to do about the write action module type. So this was fairly simple, I hope. The last thing that we now need to do is to actually implement the recovery task, which we have defined here. So this is something that's attached to our monitor. And as you can see from the recovery properties, we have called this one SCOMSPN check.recovery.hostname SPN add. And we also have a recovery for SCOMSPN check.recovery.fqdn SPN add. So one for the hostname and one for the FQDN. Once again, it's targeted at our management server because this is where the run as the service principal is in relation to. So during the first customer scenario, we decided we didn't need any classes because we're going to use the management server class. As you can see, we also configured the recovery task to work with the host name SPN check and the FQDN SPN check monitor, which creates the actual alert if the SPN isn't registered. Then we also included execute on state warning, similar to the severity of the warning. And then we have the write action account, which we saw previously, where we added our run as profile. And then for the write action account, we have the SPN to add host name. And here we have the SPN to add FQDN. So we didn't include a recovery task for both, because when we discussed the tasks during exercise 2, we actually had 3, where we can also use the task to add both SPNs. So we have 2 monitors, one for the host name, one for the FQDN, and we have the corresponding recovery tasks. And the great thing about implementing such a recovery is that now whenever our monitor triggers a warning alert, the recovery task will automatically kick in and try to resolve by registering the correct SPN. So for this, it's very important, like Ruud already mentioned during the security consideration, that we have a user account set up, that the user account has been defined as a run as account within Operations Manager and has been configured within our run as profile to tie everything together. So whenever the recovery task kicks in, it uses the appropriate user account with just enough permissions to register the SPN, and then the alerts, whenever raised, should be resolved because the recovery kicks in with the appropriate account. So sounds like sounds like a lot of fun. So this is where monitoring meets automation, and we can just sit back and relax to see everything in work, get to work. There's one bonus to this, because as you've seen from the previous slide, right action module type, we introduced the run as account, the run as profile within our right action module. And this means that whenever we run the manual task, like we did in exercise 2, it automatically picks up any run as account defined in our run as profile. So where Ruud previously had to enter his alternate credentials, he can now just run the manual task and it'll run correctly if we have the appropriate run as account configured with our run as profile. But then again, with the recovery task kicking in automatically, we hopefully never have to use those manual tasks again.
Serge, maybe a good idea to try a demo and see if we can screw it up again.
Yes, please go ahead. Floor is yours.
This is a freestyle, so most likely it will go wrong like every time. No, I'm kidding.
It'll be the running gag of all our demos, and
yeah, most likely it will indeed. So what we have is we've got the profile, and we've named the profile with the display string as SCOM SPN check run as profile, and by default you can see there's nothing in there. So just going back one step, we're going to run as account, and we created a run as account, and the name of this account in this case is SCOM SPN add. We've got a username, got a credentials, of course, and one important thing is distribution. Always set it to more secure, and in this case I've distributed to the all management server resource pool. Why is all management servers need this specific credential? Distributed to all management servers. One thing, of course, and especially with the change to SCOM 2019, make sure that the account has login as a service rights. Be aware of that. So that's one thing that's required. That's done in this case for this account. So one thing we need to do is we need to make sure that the profile is set up correctly. So we're going back to the profile, going to specify here, and we're going to say my run as account, which is SCOM SPN add. And in this case, I will say all targeted objects. Let me see if I can get there. It's just nicely hidden at a place where I can barely reach it. And there I can close it. So one thing we need to do is we need to wait a bit before the credentials and everything has been received. We can give it a quick try to see how quickly it actually is being picked up.
Well, but it's actually good. It's actually good to see that at least one alert got resolved because of running the manual task.
Now we're still going to run the manual task for one, because the in my environment, at least, what I've did for now is I disabled the recovery because otherwise I couldn't demonstrate the manual task. So for me, the recovery task is disabled. Otherwise, every single time I want to run the manual task, then I need to be quick enough. And as you noticed, I'm not the quickest in a lot of things. So I've disabled the recoveries for now. And this one is about the data access service SPN for the FQDN. So let's give it a try. With a little bit of luck, it's already there. So we're going to use the SPN FQDN. And if you can remember, if I using the normal account originally, then I would get an error, and I'm still getting the error because in this case, most likely it's still a timing thing. So what I would say is for now, I would say let's go to the exercise, to exercise 3, and hopefully after the exercise 3, timing at least has been at least everything set correctly, and then I can properly demonstrate it. Shall I explain exercise 3, Serge?
Sure, go ahead.
No response. So yes, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a recovery task. We've got a little bonus, and the bonus is more or less, that bonus sort of disappears, but it's the bonus what automatically happens is to the, that it automatically works for the task as well. Again, check in the folder for exercise 3. This one should be a relatively short one. We've set 15 minutes, most likely will be quicker, but then you can quickly catch a break and get something to drink before we are going to finalize this workshop. So thanks again for joining. Good luck with exercise 3, and see you in about 15 minutes. Hey, thanks for being back after exercise 3. I know you most likely can remember because it's not that long ago. My task didn't work with the credentials, and I figured out why. And the reason was pretty simple. I noticed while making the presentation that there was one screenshot still off. So I had to change something in my screenshots. So I had to make a new screenshot. What was that I needed a screenshot without the Renes profile added to my write action. So this part. So I removed it. I built my management pack, imported the management pack into my environment, and of course started testing, which of course didn't work because now my write action was lacking the Renes account. So both my recovery, which I've got disabled for the moment, and my task didn't work. But luckily we figured it out due to this demo. So one thing I want to present you is, hey, it can actually work with the Renes account. So this one will actually fall away pretty quickly because this one will already exist. But what we can do, it's just going to be fun to show, is the, oh, there, hey, this is a good demo. You can see it disappearing.
Nice. Good
So,
timing.
so here what we'll do is we'll add both of them. So we've got the SPN both, add data access service SDK. If you will run this, I'm not going to specify any credentials. I'm going to do run. And you can see here checking, and then you can see a registering service principal name. And you can see here, hey, duplicate SPNs found. So one of the SPNs already is actually existing for those. So even the result here, what you can see is there were already 3 SPNs. So one of the good beauties is even if you run this task and the SPNs already exist, it will actually do that check for you because we're using in this case the -s switch for a SZSPN, which is the one where you're going to check for duplicates. So for that one, the second one, it actually never did that. So the result will be that all of these alerts will actually disappear and we've got all SPNs registered and therefore the alerts will disappear. So that was why it wasn't working before you started with the exercise. So then we are at the recap. So the honors to Serge to do those.
Thank you, and thank you, Ruud, for demonstrating that the manual task actually works without having to provide the alternate credentials, thanks to the runners account and the runners profile we introduced. So let's do a quick recap of our customer scenarios, our exercises, everything we discussed today during this session. So one of the most important things is to talk to your customer and to analyze the application. So we're the monitoring experts. Ruud and I consider ourselves to be monitoring experts, but mostly on a technical level. So we know how to work with SCOM and we know how to author management packs. So from a monitoring tool perspective, there's a lot of stuff we can arrange. So if you want it monitored, it can be done. But we're not experts on any or every application. So I do know a little bit about Active Directory. I do know a little bit about SQL Server, and I'm pretty sure the same applies to Ruud, and I'm sure the same applies to you as well. So it's very important for us to have a good understanding of how the application works and what it is the customer actually wants to have monitored. And don't get fooled by remarks like everything, because it's not very advisable to just monitor everything. So talk to your customer and analyze the application, find out anything you can. And that also allows you to manage the expectation from what you can monitor, what you cannot monitor, why you cannot monitor it, and it'll help you deliver a management pack and monitoring from SCOM in this specific case that'll suit the customer's need. So that's very important for us to do. And Ruud, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, so one thing that we didn't touch here, we touched it very briefly, was the service model. And for me personally, I think one of the most important things of designing a proper management pack is the service model. And one of the simple questions that you can ask your customer is, how does your application look like? And I don't know if Sergey actually will concur, but most of the time you'll get an application owner looking at you saying, yeah, but I don't know either. But it's his responsibility to tell you how his application, how it looks, what kind of roles does it have? Does it have a front end, back end, web server, database role? So in this case, it was fairly simple. We only had a management server, so it was only one role. But especially the service model part is usually the most difficult part of all, and can take most of the time. And will also affect how all of your other steps will actually take, because you need to create classes, relationships that will affect almost everything. So that part is really important.
Yeah, most definitely. Thanks. So thanks for the addition, Ruud. I concur. I also meet a lot of customers where the application owner also has no ID and expects me just to arrange everything. So from a technical SCOM level, no problem. But in terms of what you want to see monitored, I don't know what's important to you. So that conversation really helps you designing your management pack, also which classes you're going to use, the service model, as Ruud already mentioned, relationships between any classes you might have. So then we went ahead and used the PowerShell scripts that were provided to us by the customer. So fortunately, we didn't have to think on that PowerShell code ourselves, because the customer already had it from an automation perspective, not wanting to do everything manually, but instead put it in a script. So basically, the only thing we actually needed to do was to make sure that we can connect to SCOM. So we did that using the $API variable, where we had the mom script API object to connect PowerShell to Operations Manager. And then we used the log script event to write an event in the Operations Manager event log for debugging purposes, troubleshooting purposes. So like Ruud mentioned, be very careful with what you put in your event log, because you don't want to flood it. You only want to have meaningful events in there. Also remember that if you put in an event that something's broken, you might want to put in an event to let the administrator know that it's working again. It'll be a lot easier when you're going to do monitoring on specific event IDs where you can correlate them together. And then in our PowerShell script, we collected all kinds of information, Booleans, true, false. Does the SPN exist or not? Is it registered correctly or not? Some additional info, what we actually found and what we expected to find. We put it all in a property bag. And then at the end, we made sure we mentioned the property bag specifically so that it would return all data to Operations Manager. I must say, to be very honest, that on occasion I tend to forget at the end of my script to return the actual object, and that a lot of stuff is happening in Operations Manager, except for the part where I actually deliver the data from my PowerShell script to Operations Manager. So effectively, my condition detection modules aren't doing anything because there's simply no data. So that's one to keep in mind. Ruud, do you perhaps have some PowerShell tips and tricks you might want to share that I forgot to mention?
No, you covered it all.
Thanks. So then a very, very important consideration, your run as accounts. Like Ruud mentioned, make sure that you always used the least privilege model. So don't go meddling with domain admin accounts. You have more than enough permissions with which you can meddle if you're using a domain admin account, and you're very likely to perhaps break stuff. So use the least privilege model. And make sure you document it even on an Active Directory user account or group managed service object level, so that everyone knows what the account is for, what it does, what it doesn't do. If you want it to be even more secure, you can have the actual Active Directory administrator come in and type the password for you so that you're not aware of the password, which should make it even a little bit more secure.
Yeah, maybe one thing to add to it. I never want to be the owner of the Runes account. I want to make sure that the application, that the team responsible for that application is owner of the application. And you mentioned it right. I don't want to know the password. That password needs to be stored in a certain safe for that specific team.
Yeah.
We only have it in SCOM to run certain things, but I don't want to be an owner of it because I don't want to be responsible for it. And I don't want to have the idea that people think that I can use this account freely or anything. No. So if you're going to use such an account, in this case, make sure that the team that actually is responsible for it, so the team where you're going to monitor for, is also the owner of the account.
Yeah, totally agree. Thanks for the great addition, Ruud. I just want to think about management pack authoring, PowerShell coding, that kind of fun stuff, and leave the accounts far away from me. So as you noticed, during the scenarios and exercises, we created our own probe action module type, where we might have used already existing module types, but we had a very specific override requirement, which cannot be handled with all the available module types already. So that's our reason for introducing a probe action module type where you can actually take those override requirements into account. So for this specific module type, it was the domain, as you saw slides. So that was our requirement for the probe action module type, which has also something to do with talk to your customer, analyze the application, think on all the classes, think on your source model. It also boils down to whether you need to have additional module types created because you have specific override requirements. So please also remember to use the management pack browser, which will allow you to look in resources, for example, or type definitions and then module types and then monitor types. There's tons of useful stuff that you can reuse without having to reinvent the wheel. And remember, Ruud and I are very lazy, so we love to reuse existing code, work on the success of others to be successful too, hopefully. And then last but not least, one data source for cookdown. So we used just one data source. And if you think about using just one data source, you will enable SCOM, the use of cookdown. And maybe Ruud, this is something interesting you want to elaborate on?
Yeah, so I already mentioned it briefly, but if you are not going to use anything, if you can use multiple data sources, and there's a high chance of it will actually happen, is that the script will run for each individual monitor. And that would be, of course, a waste, because that means that the script runs twice. In this case, the script is actually not really something that will ask for a lot of resources, but it's not the only thing that's being monitored at that machine. And it's something you have to keep in mind for also other projects where, for example, you have a PowerShell script that will actually take use a lot of resources or take some considerable time. Therefore, you need to have cookdown, and cookdown means in this case is that it will only run once, even if you're going to run it for multiple instances. It's not applicable here, or for multiple monitors. So in this case, it will only run once. So one thing that's missing, of course, in the recap, that we also create, of course, the write action module type. That is what we created, and we used it in this case for both our tasks and for our recovery task. So we can use one write action module type for both of these situations, which therefore was your exercise 3 is relatively short. And of course, important, already mentioned, but the Runes account is, especially for the recovery, was in this specific case really important. Because in that case, of course, you can't use the annual, you can't have any manual input. you need to have it run completely automatically, and therefore you needed to run as account. I think that was all for this now, for the recap, Sergio. Did we miss anything?
No, I don't think so. It was very good for you to mention the right action module as well, because that's a very important one too, especially with the introduction of the runner's profile. So thanks. I don't think there's anything more we need to recap on. So I hope you had a lot of fun working on the exercises, and hopefully looking at our presentation and our slides. I can imagine, and I might imagine Ruud as well, you have some questions. So please feel free to ask any questions or leave some remarks. Now is the time, so please go ahead.
Thanks for all your questions. Both from me and Serge, of course. A big thank you for joining again for this second SCOMathon. Also the second one we are attending as a host. Hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully see you next time.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your good questions, for attending. Hope you had lots of fun. I did. I'm pretty sure Ruud did as well. And see you at the next SCOMathon.